So today we welcome Professor Geoffrey Cantor, who, as you'll know, is Professor of the History of Science at the University of Leeds, where he's been there for some years now, and has originally a background in physics, and then came from physics particularly into the study of optics, and from there ended up studying Michael Faraday, and indeed wrote a very well-known biography of Michael Faraday, which I remember reading in the early 1990s, and which was always, I think, part of the influence, in fact, of how our own institute came to be called the Faraday Institute. So we should acknowledge that particular, the role of that particular biography in there. So thank you. Then later on, Professor Cantor gave the Gifford Lectures in Glasgow together with John Henry Brooke, and they were published. Another wonderful book. If you haven't read that, it's certainly worth getting hold of. And then a number of other books more recently, including, of course, one which is sort of sets the scene for our theme today. So Professor Cantor is going to speak to us on the Bible, the creation, and the inner light, tensions within Quaker science. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. And I was indeed somewhat interested in that you did adopt the name Faraday, not least because he does seem to exemplify something about the science-religion interrelation, but also perhaps it makes amends, if I can put it that way, for the fact that he felt that this was an alien religious world during his own time, when, being a dissenter, that not only was he not allowed to really graduate from this university had he even wanted to, but he looked upon, I think, Cambridge as a place which represented Anglicanism and found that rather distasteful. Now, in contrast to Faraday, whose science cohered with a very unified Christian worldview, I want today to reflect on some of the tensions and conflicts within the science and religion domain. Now, we're all familiar with the well-tried conflict thesis, which tends to pit science against religion in any of a number of ways. For some people, it's the clash between two major power blocks. In other cases, it's pitting faith against reason. And although this view is widely held and has, in a sense, gained quite an impetus from such effective proponents as Richard Dawkins, and also the high-profile controversies over evolution and intelligent design, historians like John Brooke, Ron Numbers, who you had here last week, and myself and quite a few others, have repeatedly argued that a close examination of the historical evidence shows that interactions between science and religion are intrinsically vastly more complex, vastly more interesting, and that the conflict thesis is not only easily refuted, it seems to play a very specific ideological role in certain contexts, and one context which we want to, in a sense, transcend. Now, these historians have likewise criticised the view that science has some kind of necessary harmony between science and religion. Again, that prevalent view doesn't stand up at all well to historical investigation. Now, in this talk, I want to, in a sense, revive the conflict thesis, but not the hoary old one with a capital C, capital T. Now, through this case study of early Quaker views about creation, what I want to do is to draw attention to certain kinds of what can perhaps be called conflict that arise when people encounter profound conceptual distances within themselves over their relationship on the one hand to science and the other hand to religion. To use Tom Kuhn's well-tried phrase, there exists an essential tension, which I want to investigate between science and religion through this case study. And just as in Kuhn's own account of science, such tensions can be very creative, but they can also be debilitating, and in other cases, they go, sadly, unrecognised. Now, a central theme will be some kind of basic incompatibility between certain core Quaker spirituality and the Quakers' increasing involvement in the physical world. At the outset, it may be helpful just to articulate my thesis from an historical standpoint, taking a rather more longue durée than I shall in the talk itself. Now, Quakerism was founded around the middle of the 17th century in the midst of great social, political and religious upheavals in this country. And the early Quakers adopted what can best be called a spiritual Weltanschauung, which I shall go on to discuss, and one which also implied very strongly in their writings, and I'll give you evidence of this, a renunciation of the physical world. The study of the physical world certainly was inimical to these early Quakers, and that's the beginning, as it were, of the longue durée. If you fast forward now to the 19th and indeed 20th centuries, one finds that a large number of Quakers were attracted towards science, and indeed a number became very leading scientists, Arthur Eddington being the best known of a local example. And for many of these scientists, they viewed their pursuit in science as part of their spiritual quest, not opposed to their spiritual quest. And what I want to do in this paper is to see how this change occurred. And today's paper will trace just one theme in this wider sort of historical change between the early Quakers and the Quaker scientists of the particular 19th century. So the focus of this paper will be very much on the late 17th century and 18th century. Let me start by talking about Quaker thought and the central concept within Quaker thought of the inward light, the light within, or sometimes called the light of Christ. Indeed, what demarcates Quakers from most other religious groups has been the commitment to this powerful source of religious illumination which resides in each and every individual. Now, the doctrine of the inner light denies the need then for any kind of intermediary between the individual and God. It also implies the social radical doctrine that no distinctions should be acknowledged between individuals in terms of their social rank, their title, or their gender. Quakers, therefore, were often seen as challenging the contemporary social order. And this resulted in large numbers of them being imprisoned for misdemeanours such as refusing to take their hats off when summoned to appear before a magistrate. Now, early Quakers, such as George Fox, who's often seen as the sort of founder of the movement, severely criticised those who looked to the Bible as the foundation of their religion and used this as a sort of rule book containing a fit set of doctrines that had to be slavishly followed. For example, in his journal, Fox described an encounter with a priest who informed his listeners that the Bible is the touchstone and judge by which people are to tell all doctrines, religions, opinion, and to end all controversy. Now, in responding to this priest, Fox chastised those who view the Bible rather simplistically as a repository of truth. He therefore turns round to the priest and appeals to the assembled crowd and says, God does not dwell in temples made by the hands. God does not dwell in books or in churches. A book is a merely physical thing. And it's only when the Bible is illuminated by the reader's inward light that its true spiritual meaning can be perceived. As one late 17th century Quaker, Robert Barclay, argued, the printed Bible cannot be the word of God, since the word of God is like unto himself, spiritual, and therefore cannot be heard or read with the natural external senses as the scriptures can. Instead, he argues, the word of God as written in the Bible can only be appreciated, can only really see its true spiritual meaning when illuminated by the inward light. Now, this notion of the inward light is rooted itself in biblical sources, principally the New Testament and especially John's Gospel. For example, there Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, and shall have the light of life. And this is very central to Fox and other early Quaker writing. Fox claims to have received divine illumination, which directed him to enlighten every man by the divine light of Christ. And he says, one of his entries, that he's sent to turn people from darkness to the light, that they may receive Jesus Christ. Now, the inward light provides communication with God and guides Quakers in all aspects of their lives. As one early Quaker writes, "Through this light we come to know good from evil, right from wrong, and whatever is of God, according to him, from what is of the devil, and what is contrary to God, in motion, word, and works." Thus, in contrast to a prevalent view that God communicates only through the Bible with humankind, Quakers insist on the primacy of the inward light. As people's inward lights are continually active, Quakers adhere to the doctrine of a continuous revelation. To quote Berkeley again, "This immediate speaking never ceased in any age." And more importantly, a properly attuned inward light can determine truth with a capital T, a word which plays a very central role in Quaker epistemology. Indeed, Quakers have often portrayed themselves primarily as seekers after truth. Let's turn to how they understood creation, and particularly the early verses of Genesis. Early Quakers often articulated a three-stage historical narrative of creation based on their understanding of certain biblical passages in both the Old and New Testaments. First, God created a paradisical world in which all creatures, men included, participated in harmonious unity. Then man turns to evil and poisoned all that God had created. With the fall, nature becomes a scene of conflict. Finally, through a new covenant with Christ, humankind is redeemed, and thus opening the prospect of paradise regained, the new creation. And this account is very much sort of structured within a rhetoric of exhortation. Early Quaker writers appealed to Genesis, formed a part of a divinely ordained history in which they saw themselves as influencing the arrival of the new creation period of redemption. But what I want to do is focus particularly on the second stage, the period following the fall. And in these early Quaker narratives, and these are almost entirely written in the 1650s, man had lost his innocence and sunk into a sinful state. He is at the mercy of external senses, and the serpent of physicality leads him further astray. Not only is sensory knowledge seen as deceptive, but it is part of the very fallen world in which we live. And it stands in opposition to true knowledge. Knowledge not of the through the outer senses, but of the inner sense, the inward light. Moreover, Quakers tended to be sceptical about the power of reason, although some were more willing to trust it than others. To give one view of the period, reason was the tool of the devil. One Quaker explains this in terms of the creation, the fall, and describes how the serpent is to draw man unto reasoning. By hearkening to the serpent and entering into reason and consulting, the serpent keeps a veil over man so that he cannot see the true light of salvation. To give you one example, in William Smith's New Creation Brought Forth of 1661, we find a description of the situation after the fall. I quote, "The seed kept its purity," the inward light of the seed, "though man went from it, and did not abide by it. And the pure light, in its own quality, did shine in man's conscience, and was made manifest in the eternal love, to convince him of all his evil ways. By turning his back on the light, man was trapped in the fallen world. However, gradually, the pure light that shines forth from his conscience will," says Smith, "enable him to recognize how immersed he is in evil and how far from God. And a continual struggle ensues." So the position, in a sense, of man is that in the state of we are in the state of darkness, trying to, as it were, reach the light, the new creation. Now, while man is the subject of the creation narrative, other parts of creation undergo parallel series of changes. For example, Francis Howgill, a Quaker of the period, noted that with the fall of man, man became brutish. And he also writes of man's carnal mind. Man is nothing more than a physical animal. The account of God's creatures, given in one of Edward Burroughs' works, makes clear the state of the creatures depends upon the spiritual state of man. Thus, while no creature, he writes, was evil and defiled in its original creation, after the fall, man infects the other creatures with his evil and his corruption. He makes all creatures evil, and his exercise of them, and he corrupts them and perverts them to another end than wherefore they were created, and by the creatures dishonours the Creator. With the new covenant, the creatures will also be restored to their rightful place. There will be harmony in the world. Man will have dominion and stewardship over the creatures, but will not harm them. Now, the dominant themes in these early creation narratives is a complete harmony and unity that existed in the initial creation. And one finds in the comments of Fox and quite a number of other writers that in our present state of disunity between ourselves and the rest of creation, man has to try and take the lead in imposing some kind of order. For example, amongst the advice which George Fox gives to the Rump Parliament of 1659 is to advise them how to create a moral Christian country. And he tells the parliamentarians to avoid football, shovelboard, vain musics, but they should also shun cruel sports like bull baiting, cockfighting, and even horse racing. There's a very sort of strong link here between man's cruelty to other people and man's cruelty to the animal world, and Fox abhorred both of those. This kind of vision of unity and harmony in the creation stands in stark contrast to the perceived state of the post-Lapsarian world. After the fall, not only was there conflict, and is there conflict between man and the rest of the creation, but the aim of Quakers, time and time again, is a spiritual way of redressing this. Some of the early Quakers saw the kind of science as practiced at the Royal Society as inimical to this spiritual odyssey. One finds, for example, Isaac Pennington arguing in a tract of 1668 in which he attacks the Royal Society. The study of nature, the study of physical nature, does not lead to truth, spiritual truth. And those who pursue science are not merely wasting their time, but by doing so, they are diverting their energies away from the true path of spiritual redemption. The repeated emphasis on the ultimate importance of the spiritual path and the repeated repudiation of the physical and the sensual would seem to make Quakers completely antipathetic to the study of nature. Unlike those commentators who reflected on the physical processes which were described in the early verses of the Bible, all the Quaker discussions of the opening verses of Genesis that I've been able to find emphasize very much its spiritual meaning. For example, Robert Barclay talks about when the only verse he mentions is the second verse, the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. His only interest there is the Spirit, not the waters. Now the early Quakers therefore thought that they were about to witness the New Jerusalem. It was just round the corner, they felt. That they would participate in this new creation and see paradise regained upon earth. However, of course, that didn't happen. There was a restoration of the king, that's something rather different, but it did bring about quite a significant change over the next couple of decades in Quaker mores. They lost much of their radical vision, and they also found that they had to support themselves and their families. They had to educate their children in Christian principles. These mundane considerations increasingly impinged upon the Quaker psyche, and the challenge, as so often stated, was, how to be in this world, but not of this world. And one finds, as this phrase connotes, that they're really being pulled in two rather different directions. While seeking to retain the values and visions of the early Quakers, and especially the fundamental importance according to the inner light, Quakers not only lost much of their messianic zeal, but also became increasingly prosperous and respectable members of British society. We find them participating in such worldly activities as trade and commerce, while at the same time trying to maintain their distinctive religious and moral stance on a range of issues. For example, many Quakers became merchants and bankers, but they tried to pursue business practices that accorded with their consciences. For example, they refused to manufacture arms or to engage in the slave trade after about the early decades of the 18th century. The situation in some ways in science is rather similar. As Quakers moved away from the Illuminist sort of roots of Quakerism, they began to engage the physical world in new and different ways. But in doing so, I want to argue, they came across the kind of tensions which I alluded to earlier and which I'll spell out in detail as we proceed. And I think there are three main paths which they travelled in engaging the physical world, and I'll deal with each very briefly. The first is in education and careers, secondly in medicine, and third in something which sounds most unquakerly, recreation. First of all, what about educational contexts? Now, while the first generation of Quakers expressed little concern about education, after all, if the New Jerusalem was going to take place, why worry too much about schools and things like that? It subsequently becomes a major issue for them. And they send every year from the yearly meeting an epistle, and time and again it deals with issues of education, and there are also numerous pamphlets. And the emphasis, time and again, is that parents and school teachers should bring their children up in the proper, godly, Quakerly way, and not allow them to slip into vice or sin, and certainly not go to Anglican or other non-Quaker school teachers who would indoctrinate their children in the wrong values. Now, this literature contains principally admonitory advice, but some Quakers, nonetheless, do consider that the study of nature is a moral, innocent, and godly subject for the young. So we find George Fox instructing one of his followers to establish a school for teaching languages together with the nature of herbs, roots, plants, and trees. Now, a far more sustained concern about using nature for educational purposes is to be found in the writings of William Penn, and in particular his book, Some Fruits of Solitude. And there he gives a number of reflections about how Quakers, particularly young Quakers, should proceed in their education, particularly the study of nature. And here he argues, the world is certainly a great and stately volume of natural things, and it ought to be the subject of the education of our youth, who at 20, when they should be fit for business, know very little or nothing of it. Penn urged the study of the book of nature as far more worthwhile educationally than the study of grammar, rhetoric, or foreign languages. Studying the natural world, he says, is religiously uplifting, since it displays an eternal wisdom, power, majesty, and goodness. Moreover, he argues that if we possess the appropriate scientific knowledge, we will not misuse the physical universe, since the noble creation has the stamp and voice of a deity everywhere, and is everything to the observing. So unlike the early Quakers, those in the 1650s, and indeed quite a few in the later decades when Penn himself is writing, who considered that the physical world was corrupt and we should not pay any attention to it, one finds in Penn in particular this insistence that the student should use his senses to appreciate the physical world and also to acknowledge God's creation through the study of nature. Particularly after Penn's experience of trying to create the colony on the other side of the Atlantic of Pennsylvania, he becomes very concerned about utility. That the study of nature is useful, he says, in creating a community of Quakers who can support themselves through agriculture. Now, Penn is interesting amongst the Quaker movement because he's one of the very few who was university educated. He also moved in high political circles, and he was the first Quaker probably also to show an interest in the Royal Society of London and was admitted there just before he went off to America. Now, this voice about using nature as an educational instrument is repeated numerous times by later Quakers. And we also find that a number of Quakers do take this kind of advice in terms of not just education but also in terms of careers. There's a significant number of Quakers move into such things as horticulture, and the place where I live at York at present was, in the 19th century, a Quaker nursery. Not where they sent their kids, the other kind of nursery. Most impressive is the following kind of statistic that in Scotland, where there are very few Quakers, in the period up to 1790, the most popular career for Quakers, far outweighing others, was being a gardener or seedsman. Turn now to medicine. Early Quakers considered illness to be spiritual. They were physical ailments brought about by a spiritual cause. And thus we find Fox and quite a number of the other early Quakers practicing faith healing. Fox frequently visited the sick and claimed that through the power of the Spirit he was able to cure people of their ailments, which were outwardly physical but underlyingly spiritual. To take one example among many, on a visit to Arnside, Westmoreland, Fox encountered a man called Richard Myers, whose arm was lame. Fox recounted that he was moved by the Lord to say to Richard Myers amongst all the people, "Prophet Myers, stand up upon thy legs." And he stood up, stretched out his arms and said, "Be it known unto you all people and to all nations that this day I am healed." Faith healing wasn't the only aspect of medicine which the early Quakers participated in. They were also much attracted to Hermetic ideas, and especially those of Johannes Baptista van Helmont and his son Francis Mercury van Helmont, who had a lot to do with Quakers, and some think that he actually converted to Quakerism at one point. Like the Van Helmonts, Quakers were very much opposed to Aristotelian thought and to the medical theories of Galen, and instead offered what they thought would be a spiritual-based understanding of the world. But they also followed Van Helmont into his ideas about iatrochemistry and the use of iatrochemical cures of what were essentially spiritual ailments. And quite a number of early Quakers move into pharmacy, and quite a number of them, when they do write on these issues, emphasize that the pills which they are producing are principally to cure a spiritual ailment which will have the required physical effect. What happens, though, by the early mid-18th century is that one sees a very different kind of notion of appearing amongst Quaker doctors. They move away from the Hermetic and spiritual cures, and many of them end up going to medical schools. In Holland, in Leiden in particular, and when Edinburgh Medical School opens in the 1720s there as well. And their practice of medicine loses, as far as I can see, almost all connection with these kind of emphasis on the spiritual. They seem to follow their teachers and the current medical practices in terms of offering largely physical cures for physical symptoms. The third area where Quakers seem to, as it were, be engaging the physical world in new and interesting ways is that of recreation. Despite repeated emphasis on the primacy of the spiritual life, Quakers often accepted that even a sober, spiritually aware Quaker could not permanently live in a state of religious intoxication. A prominent example of the argument run is taken from one of the main books of the sort of 1670s, Robert Barclay's Apology for a True Christian Divinity, in which it discusses how Quakers should deport themselves. In contrast to activities to avoid, such as music and playing games, Barclay also prescribed that there were certain activities which Quakers would be permitted to do, although they might not be ultimately sort of spiritual in nature. And he admits that even the most devout Quaker experiences some difficulty, he says, in constantly being intensive of mind. And then he adds, almost reluctantly, there may be a liberty allowed beyond these things, which are of absolute need for the sustenance of the outward man. I'm not content against it, provided these things be not as much wholly superfluous, or in their proper nature and tendency, and might lead to lust, vanity and wantonness. So provided you don't go over the edge, what are you allowed to do, he says. There are various innocent divertissements. For example, friends may visit one another, or hear and read history, or speak soberly of the present and past transactions, or follow after gardening, or use geometrical and mathematical experiments. And he quickly adds, just before you go off rushing into your garden, in all such things we are not so to forget God. So despite these numerous equivocations, he did seem to allow people the pleasure of gardening. And it's interesting that one finds a lot of Quakers, particularly wealthy Quakers in the 18th century, taking up gardening and the likes as part of their recreation. Two very quick examples. The London merchant Peter Collinson writes in a letter that he's retreating to his home in Peckham from the hurries of the town, the rushing about in London, where his business was. Goes to Peckham, he says, in order to breathe the air of content and quiet in his little cottage with its pretty garden well filled with plants. Or you can take right at the end of the 18th century, young William Allen, aged 14, constructing a telescope to watch the moons of Jupiter, and later in life, when he became a big chemical manufacturer, going back to his home in Stoke Newington, where he had an observatory, and spending his evenings in relaxation of looking at the planets. I now want to sort of move to the, as it were, the crucial part of this argument, to explore how we can sort of make sense of, on the one hand, the inward light, and on the other, this increasing engagement in the outside world. Because as we've seen, early Quakers often contrasted the true Christian understanding based on the inner light's insight into biblical truths with the false or shallow knowledge gained by the senses and by the operation of human reason. And throughout the 18th century, Quakers seem to have moved, becoming increasingly accepting the natural world as a legitimate realm of experience, and one from which at least some degree of spiritual insight can be obtained. Interestingly, this transition doesn't feature in many of the Quaker tracts, and one has to, I think, go more and more to diaries, to letters, and indeed Quaker poetry in order to see quite what's happening. And it's almost as if they're in denial that they have moved so far from the early Quakers and the early Quaker emphasis on spirituality and nothing but spirituality. It is to these sources we now turn. Let me first give you an example of a letter of 1772 from the physician-botanist John Fothergill to William Bartram, who was in America collecting botanical specimens for him. Bartram requests that he be sent all fragrant shrubs or plants, or such as are remarkable for the beauty or singularity of their flowers and foliage. Now, the early Quakers would not have used terms like beauty or singularity or their flowers and foliage. This was of the physical world, this was to be repudiated. And yet we have Fothergill here talking just in very physicalist terms. Although he adds immediately, but in the midst of all this, doing botany, forget not the one thing needful. In studying nature, forget not its author. So Fothergill is basically saying it's permissible to enjoy the physical world, but one must not revel in the sensory experience to the detriment of religion. But nonetheless, the crucial wall, I think, has been breached. The second example occurs in a letter dating from 1806, written by a Quaker apothecary called Joseph Gurney Bevan. Now, Bevan expresses the hope in this letter of the approaching, lengthening autumnal evenings, that they may be favourable for the exercise of that kind of meditation which carries beyond earthly things. A walk by the harvest moon may also be employed to the same purpose. A mind does not stop at creation without being led by it to the Creator, and often finds cause of reverence in his works. Now, this quotation is interesting because it indicates that Bevan had no problem, as it were, in engaging the creation in his walks, the observations he made of the physical universe, but also at the same time being able to see through that, through the physical, to the underlying flickering sense of Creator beyond. Notice, however, that it's not the kind of rationalist argument which many proponents of a kind of design argument would have used. Like many Quakers, it's very much an appeal to how the mind, or the inner light, behaves in engaging the physical world. And in the light of these kinds of concerns, it's understandable that a number of 18th century Quakers, like Bevan himself, pursued botany, astronomy, and other observational sciences. And this flourishing interest in the sciences provides evidence of it, I think, of a growing appreciation of the natural world by 18th century Quakers. My next example is from a book of poetry, put together by, as it were, two banks. Her name is Rachel Berkeley. She was a Lloyd who married a Berkeley. And she, after her death in 1792, friends and colleagues put together some of the poems which she had collected in a book for herself. She grew up in a prosperous Birmingham banking family, and married into another banking family, and she was one of those wealthy, accomplished Quakers of the late 18th century who was, it says, conversant in the useful parts of mathematics, natural philosophy and astronomy. The study of botany was one of her favourite amusements, and she collected specimens from a great number of English plants and placed them and dried them in systematic order. And in the poetry which she collects is a great deal of nature poetry. For example, there's one here, one of John Gay's poems. Still nature's various face informs my sense of an all-wise, all-powerful providence. And there are ever so many of these poems which she takes, which are just like the quotation we had earlier from Bevan, being able to, as it were, see through nature to the divine creator beyond. So one kind of response to this kind of development is simply to accept this kind of physico-theological outlook, which we've seen in these last couple of examples. But, and this is where I think the really interesting examples come in, we can see, and I'll just give you 3 examples here, a number of cases where Quaker involvement in the physical world was not a simple acceptance of this kind of physico-theological outlook, but instead it led to a deep internal conflicts. My first example doesn't quite take us all the way there, but leads us in that direction. The documentation isn't adequate to go much further. In 1705, a Quaker meeting in Ireland discovered that some Irish Quakers had paid too much attention to their gardens. And these Quakers get into immense trouble. It isn't quite clear why, whether they were vying with each other over their turnips, I'm not sure. But the Quaker minute rebukes them and says that all friends in planting seed should do so in a lowly mind and keep to plainness in the serviceable part, rather admiring the wonderful hand of Providence in causing such varieties than in pleasing the curious mind. So don't go too far down that road. My next example is a bit more explicit. It deals with a man called John Barlow, who had studied veterinary science at Edinburgh in the early 19th century, and in his early 40s he undergoes an immense illness from which he is clearly going to die. And he writes in as death approaches, "I have dearly loved science and my secular profession, and have followed it with a too exclusive devotion, perhaps made it something of an idol. Pecuniary success has not been my point of ambition. The snare has been in the over-ardent desire for the advancement of science, and perhaps some corresponding care for professional reputation." So facing death, Barlow confronted a real and ever-present conflict between the demands of science on one hand and the demands of a spiritual faith on the other. But my most revealing example I've left to last. It comes from an amazing spiritual diary which was published of the Dublin pharmacist John Rutty and covers the years 1753 to 1774. And it provides some remarkable insights into the internal conflicts of a Quaker naturalist. Not only did he attend the maladies of his patients, but he also pursued and published several scientific and medical investigations. We find him at times talking in rather providential terms about the creation of the world, and even reading the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London, perhaps not the most favourite religious work. He cries out, "Oh, the wonders of God's creation in insects, polypi, corals and madrepores." And yet, a large number of Rutty's diary entries also expose the tensions and conflicts which underlie his scientific and medical pursuits. While he is strongly attracted to the observable universe and was committed to make a close and sober study of God's creation, he found himself continually pulled by Quaker otherworldliness, that, as we have seen, deprecated interest in the mundane and the world of the external senses. In his diary entries, he repeatedly questioned whether he could both be a Quaker, committed to spiritual seeking, and also a serious student of science. His inner conflicts, that other Quakers sought to ignore, are plain to see. Take this example. Weighed the real Christian and the abstract physician in the balance of the sanctuary, and found the latter, that's the physician, to be light. Hence great self-contempt on a sober, clear review of the hitherto great and principal occupation of my life. In another example, at one Quaker meeting of worship, he reflects, "Lord, remember not the sin of my youth and age, even that of idolizing nature. Oh, give me now to redeem the time, the precious time." And yet that very afternoon, he writes, "Proceeded, however, on writing my natural history of the city of Dublin with satisfaction." On another occasion he declares, "Now is the snare laid in natural science. Lord, grant that it may be in vain." So repeatedly we see him, having one foot, as it were, in the Quaker spirituality of Fox and the other early Quakers I've talked about, and the other in the Dublin Enlightenment. Now in this paper I focus very much on this kind of issue of conflict, but not the familiar conflict which we hear about in terms of the conflict thesis, but rather one which is internal, rather the essential tension perhaps which science and religion often generate. And although my focus has been on Quaker history, the history of science and religion includes many cases of such sensitive and reflective souls like Rutty and Barlow. And members of this institute may also have personal familiarity with this kind of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey, indeed. So it's now, we've got some time for questions, and I hope we've got plenty there. Yes.
Well, Geoffrey, first of all, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I want to ask you about a comparison between two contrasts. One contrast is inner versus outer,
Yep.
and the other is following versus understanding. So when you started to give us the broad landscape of the Quaker situation, I was thinking very much of the inner-outer contrast, that the reason that the Quakers were opposed to the study of the natural world is because they felt one's focus should be firmly on the inner light. But then as you went on, it seemed to me that that wasn't a very powerful argument against studying the natural world, because by studying the natural world, you find out more about the author of the natural world, who is also the source of the inner light. So if you cared about the inner light, this would be an indirect, but perhaps very effective way of finding out more about it. But the second contrast is the idea that it isn't fundamentally inner versus outer. It's fundamentally that we're not here to understand why things are the way they are. We're not even here to understand why the inner light is the way it is. We are here to follow the inner light. And the pursuit of understanding in a kind of scientific mode may actually distract us from that following. So I'm wondering which of those two contrasts is really driving the tension.
Right. I think that they are, as it were, both there.
Yeah.
But I think they operate in very different ways. The first one I was very much sort of suggesting is one, as a historian, one can see this kind of shift taking place from the middle of the 17th century to well into the 18th. And one can see that kind of tension, not so much in terms of the admission that the tension is there, but that it actually is working out through people's experience. And as I say, what interests me also is that it does seem to come up almost in roundabout ways, and it's only in very exceptional cases like that of Rutty that somebody sees themselves in that sort of personal kind of position. But it is, if you like, in a sense, visible to, if one looks at the kind of sort of historical mode. As far as the other is concerned, I think most of those early Quakers would actually have had that initial sort of view, that their, if you like, significance within the creation was precisely to bring about the spiritual outcome. And again, I think one of the issues here is that Quakerism itself is again sort of changing. That, if you like, that way of self-actualization, self-realization, becomes more and more difficult as one moves through, and there is indeed increasing sort of tension amongst Quakers themselves over just how to interpret it. I mean, I've talked a bit about Penn because in some ways he's pretty much at one end of the spectrum in the late 18th century, and he, like Berkeley, are two of the sort of university educated ones who are, as it were, have experience over and above just seeing themselves, as it were, within the Quaker movement. I think they're much more reflective, if you like, historically, philosophically and theologically. And so I think they're able to see that other side. So you're absolutely right, there are two things there, but I think that they're working out in rather parallel ways, but people are seeing them, as it were, in rather different contexts, comparing, as it were, Rutty and Penn, that are almost at opposite ends of the sort of Quaker spectrum.
Yes.
Two questions. What is the, or what was, and what is the situation with regard to this inner light? Was it congenital or inherited or whatever? And secondly, to what extent do you see this conflict that you're describing very helpfully in the life of Michael Faraday, without giving us another lecture?
Right. Yeah, Faraday's, let me answer the last part. There are some definite conflicts in his life, but I don't think they're concerned with science and religion. And one thing which always worries me is that Darwin's book was published 8 years before he died, and he never makes a comment about it. And I have a feeling certainly by then, such conflicts were kept at on arm's length. And one of the comments I made earlier that many people do not sort of rise, as it were, to confront these kinds of conflicts. I think in Faraday's case, I'd give that as an example. As far as the inner light is concerned, it is, as it were, within each of us, and each of us, as it were, develop. I suppose it, like other aspects of learning, it becomes refined, focused as time goes on. But also, in Quaker literature, there's obviously a clear sense that some people, as it were, have it to a greater degree than others in terms of not having the inner light, but having, as it were, well-tuned one, if I can put it that way. And particularly people who do become sort of Quaker ministers who are seen as sort of leading congregations are often thought as not being different, as it were, in type, but more in degree. And that degree comes about particularly through sensitivity, experience, things like that. I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but...
Perhaps I could just ask a question on the sociology of it. But my understanding is that the individual Quaker meetings would be fairly independent from each other. I'm wondering to what extent they quite rapidly evolved in different directions. You have different lineages, making actually the task of the historian possibly quite difficult to generalize, because they're all evolving in different directions. To what extent were they centralized, and what extent do they go separate ways?
This is extremely interesting because it at one level you're absolutely right, there are differences. Most notable difference between American Quakers, who have a completely different history from the one here. Basically, the Quaker movement held itself together just about. In America, it split into 3, if not more, factions. But also, they do differ quite considerably in terms of York Quakers often contrast with Bristol Quakers, who are often very much involved in international trade and things like this. And the real, if you like, geographical hub is Westmoreland, the Lake District, which is where Quakerism grows. But you're right that each meeting is in one sense separate, but it's fitted into a very interesting sort of hierarchical scheme. The individual meetings come together to form monthly meetings, those come together to form quarterly meetings, and everything is fed up to the yearly meeting, which is held in London. And this means that information, as it were, goes up the chain, or problems, for example, if Quakers are finding, let's say, difficulty getting schoolmasters to teach their kids, that will go up the chain, and the epistle which is sent out by the yearly meeting would have something, after it's been discussed, say that we need more Quaker schoolmasters, particularly in the Yorkshire area or whatever. So it's very interesting because, in one sense, Quakerism is exceedingly individualistic. And one of the successes and this of Fox was to create an organisation of individuals. And this sort of structure somehow seems to have worked over a long period of time. And it also, when it comes to particularly sort of things like science, there are definite sort of groupings of Quakers. One which has interested me particularly is in the Lake District area, and they've got a number of Quaker meteorologists. And they're also linking to families is also very interesting because, like so many of these religious groups, there are a few very dominant families. So as well as the map of the meetings, you have a family map, which may look rather different in the sense of having members in Bristol and London. But the sociology is fascinating.
Yes, Jason.
Your talk, thank you very much for that, suggests to me an overall interpretation of Quakers in science, but I'm not quite sure I've got it right, so I just want to spit it out and see what you think of it. If you look at, you mentioned Eddington as one of the premier examples of a I guess you could say stellar scientist among the Quakers. And I've been looking through his materials, and I've yet to find him use the word Jesus, Christ, or Bible anywhere. Just even mentioning the words, let alone giving any kind of ideology based on them. And it seems to me that what you're talking about is this transition that occurred in the 18th century is that essentially the Quaker religion was diluted and toned down. That when it came to a conflict with culture and with science, it was to do away with the religion for the most part and accept, say, the science in this case. And I'm wondering if this connects with another thing you said earlier in the talk about the 17th century Quakers, that as they were trying to distance themselves from Anglicanism and other forms of established religion, they took on the natural view of the world and, say, the inner light as a means of, a basis of religion and inspiration, borrowing, in a way, an argument of the freethinkers who are trying to distance themselves also from scholastic thinking. And so by turning their schools into places which, say, studied nature and repudiating logic, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the medieval trivium, which would have taught their students how to communicate in that scholastic form, what they were doing was insulating students from that theology, which they didn't want to take a part of. But in going in league with free thinking on this, they eventually got to the situation where Eddington was, where he was not even speaking of Jesus or the Bible.
We've got 2 minutes on the tape, just to warn you. Sorry,
Right,
sorry,
okay.
it's have to be a 2-minute answer. So
Very quickly, Quakerism undergoes some major shifts, one of which is very much closely connected with Eddington, and for many Quakers, reacting very much against the evangelical Quakers of the 19th century was just the kind of position one finds with Eddington. So I want to emphasise sort of a certain amount of discontinuity there, but also diversity, again, within within Quaker history. The second point is Quakers seem to be, and I'm not a Quaker, very divided over your thesis. For some, the 17th century is where it was. For other people, it is the real Quakerism that really only develops from that. And throughout the history of Quakerism, there has been, as it were, this moving away and this coming back to, and indeed part of the reaction against evangelicalism in the 19th century was the view which some Quakers held that what Fox was putting forward was a Quakerism without Jesus. Despite my quotation, because there are the passages you can read. As far as Quaker links are concerned, they are clearly sort of being influenced by all sorts of issues outside themselves, and of course what they're doing in the 17th century is very similar to what's going on in so many other little revolutionary groupings, and it would be entirely wrong, as it were, to see the history of Quakerism, as it were, cut off from these other realms. But I think if you look at what's driving Quakers, certainly in the 18th century, it is an attempt to move away from, if you like, the less acceptable part, what many of them see as the less acceptable parts of mid-17th century. The outrageous guy is a fine guy called James Naylor, who was riding naked through Bristol, proclaiming the second coming of Christ, and George Fox cuts him dead, eliminates him from the Quaker movement, and for many people this is the moment when Quakers start to become respectable and just disown that aspect, and that we're past 2 o'clock.